Hello, welcome to your asynchronous lesson 4.5. Reconstruction part 2 is the title I have here. What we're actually going to be talking about here is the end of Reconstruction. So I made an adjustment to our unit plan, end of Reconstruction and the legacy of Reconstruction this week. So this video you're watching today is going to mark the end of the Reconstruction era. That's what we're going to be focused on. We'll talk a little bit during our synchronous lesson this week about the legacy of Reconstruction, sort of the long-term effects of this period, how it influences the world we live in today, things of that nature. You've all seen the slide before. So what is Reconstruction? To construct again, to build again. When we talk about it in terms of US history, we're talking about this specific era, 1863 to 1877. This is the period that we're really focused on the idea of rebuilding. This doesn't mean that after 1877, we're not doing any of this work anymore. It doesn't mean that any of these problems have gone away. It's just the end of the real American focus, unified focus on this idea. The reason we use 1877 is when the last northern troops leave the southern states. So if you remember the Reconstruction Acts, we talked about a military presence. We talked about the military districts and generals that were overseeing the behavior of the South. 1877 is when they leave, for reasons we will see in just a moment. So the end of the Reconstruction era, just one more time. So beginning in the mid-1870s, this is 10 years after the Civil War ends, we're going to see the active period of Reconstruction ends. I'll highlight that federal laws don't necessarily change, right? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that we talked about, they still exist. But what ends up happening is the end of Reconstruction means less oversight. So the military presence in the South is going to leave. Less oversight means it's easier for Southern states to work around the laws and to figure out ways to limit the freedom of Black Americans. We talked a bunch about that this week, right? We talked about how the Black codes or the 15th Amendment might say, okay, you have to give people the right to vote, but Black codes might be written to say, all right, we'll give them the right to vote, but they're not allowed to enter the town. Or you might write laws so that you can arrest Black Americans. And then once they're arrested, they can't vote. So figuring out ways to say, okay, well, they have the right to vote, but because racists do racist things, figuring out ways to limit the freedom that they can actually express in their lives. The end of Reconstruction really coincides with the election of 1876. One more compromise we're going to work on here, the Compromise of 1877. I did a lowercase c because some of our other compromises that we've covered have been actual things that there's documentation for. This is unofficial. This is unwritten. This is a backroom deal between politicians to come up with a solution. So in the election of 1876, we need 185 electoral votes to win. So whichever candidate gets 185 becomes the president. That's how the electoral college system works. There's a threshold. Once you cross it, you win. We have two candidates, Rutherford B. Hayes. He, after election day, has 165 electoral votes, and Samuel Tilden, who has 184. If you're paying attention, both 165 and 184 are less than 185. Neither of them become the president directly after the election. We have 20 electoral votes that are unresolved, that are contested in various states for a couple different reasons. So despite the fact that Tilden is almost in all ways the logical choice here, he has more electoral votes. He was doing better in polls, so it appeared that people wanted him to be president. More people voted for him. And I mentioned he was leading in electoral votes. Compromise is agreed on. So the compromise is going to give the presidency to Hayes. This guy here with the beard is Hayes. He'll get actually all 20 of the unresolved electoral votes in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. As I mentioned, it's this removal that we use as sort of the end of Reconstruction. A couple other things about this compromise. I guess I'll highlight sort of the dates just so you're aware. So we call it the Compromise of 1877. The election was in 1876. If you are paying attention, we talked about it with the Civil War as well. The election takes place in November. The president is seated at this point in April. So there is a middle period that crosses into the new year. So if you see 1876 election, you see Compromise of 1877. These are happening during the same sort of period of time after the election, before the new president is seated. So, Compromise of 1877, unwritten deal between Democrats and Republicans. As I mentioned, it settles the 1876 election. It makes Hayes president. The agreement is to withdraw the remaining northern troops from the South. It's also to allow the southern states to legislate without northern interference. So we talked about before the South trying to pass these laws, and they were doing that with the North paying attention. Part of this deal is that the North is going to kind of stay out of southern lawmaking. I'll ask you, what do we think this means for Black Americans, considering what we know about the Civil War, what we know about Reconstruction? What does the northern military, the northern government not paying attention to what the South is doing anymore? What does that mean for Black Americans in the South? A couple other terms I'll mention just to mention. We were going to build a transcontinental railroad, so a coast-to-coast railroad. That never happened. Perhaps more importantly, for reasons that we'll talk about during our lesson this week, part of the agreement was that there would be legislation, that we would pass some laws that would help the South industrialize. That also never happens. End of Reconstruction again. So in addition to the election of 1876, Compromise of 1877, the end of Reconstruction is happening for a bunch of different reasons. So the first reason might be the most relevant. Like, Northerners just kind of lose interest, right? Reconstruction is expensive. It requires troops, so it requires people to leave their homes and spend time living in the South. It requires a lot of time, a lot of oversight, a lot of effort. After 10 years or so of this, the North is just kind of getting a little bit bored. They're starting to, first off, starting to see like conflict and violence aren't stopping. They didn't stop in the decade after. If anything, the conflict and violence gets worse. It becomes more organized. So this is where we really see groups like the KKK, the White League, which is similar to the KKK, and also the Redeemers, which I'll talk about in a second. But we see these groups like anti-interference, anti-Black, pro-Southern individuals start to organize into like machines, like groups that can really do organized violence, that can really do organized politics. The Redeemers are a political organization. So there are a bunch of like wealthy Southern landowners who like come together, form a political coalition, a political group, a political team, and like organization means they have a lot of resources that they can throw at the problem, and they can throw those resources at it together. All of this ends up being like Northerners just being like, all right, fine. White Southerners are not going to change. Or maybe not all Northerners, but enough of them are starting to be like, okay, well, why are we doing this? Like, we're fighting, we're doing all of these things, we're arguing, we're doing this oversight. Like, they're not going to change. Let's just close that door and move on. In addition to that, we have an economic depression. So the country just has less money. Less money means limited funds for things like oversight, for resources to help people in the South, stuff like that. That's all I have. That's the end of Reconstruction in 10 minutes or less. We'll talk a little bit more about it in class on Monday. And then, as I said, we will talk about the legacy of Reconstruction when we meet. I just want to point out one more thing before I let you go, since I have you here. If you're looking over the slides to study for your assessment or looking over them for any other reason, I don't think I mentioned this to you, but I've included this little button at the bottom of the asynchronous lessons. So if you're scrolling through the slides and you're trying to find something, we've got a little button to tell you which one I recorded, and then the lesson slide without the button is what we did in class. Thank you, and I'll see you all in class this week.